Sol System, Mars, ODR Recruit Depot, Recruit J. Kurt. When you enter the proving grounds, you will be tested, physically and mentally. Hotel Company will be competing against two others, Golf and India. They've been given the same mission as you, to make it to the top and prevent your enemy from completing. Slaughter paused. You will also be tested against a third element. It's new training tech designed to add a third dimension to combat. Jay recalled the words said to him and the rest of his company by their senior drill instructor, Gunny Slaughter. Their orders were more detailed when the platoons broke off from the main body and into their trucks, which drove them to a designated starting point. Since they are in competition with two other companies, all authority was delegated to the squad leaders, then to the fire team leaders if the mission deemed it so. The third element that they were warned about was vague, but they were told that there were additional supplies available if each platoon was able to clear compounds which were home to the third entity. Jay found the secrecy of this culminating event intriguing, since all information regarding it was kept hidden until the day of or during the event itself. Any attempts to ask any current raider was quickly met with denial. An unspoken oath of secrecy, he thought, which did wonders for his imagination. His platoon patrolled the path in a tactical column, where each individual was 10 to 15 paces from each other in staggered form, ensuring there would be no collateral kills in a real combat scenario. It was also the most common formation when traveling in silence while still on the alert. The Proving Grounds was their last major event in recruit training to graduate. Participants needed to make it to the top of the mountain at the center of the training area. The arena was split up into 3 sections, which he still knew little of. From what the instructors told them before, the first area was centered on team building and combat maneuvers. The second was where they would be loaded with simunition of their own, and the final was a large climb. After recounting the knowledge he had of the Proving Grounds, the platoon came to a halt, and the squad leaders gathered them around a sign before the obstacle. It was a wide but long series of crawls and multiple walls and debris to navigate while staying low. The trails were freshly watered and muddy. This fact alone made many uncomfortable, because that meant they were going to get dirty, and it would most likely remain that way over the next 2 days. The sign was simple. It provided details for not just this immediate course, but for 3 others beyond it. However, for the first course, it stated the need to stay on the course and to stay low. The second was a test of alternating advances called buddy rushing. The third was to scale walls with increasing difficulty mixed with agility and rope climbing. The fourth and final was an active patrol scenario, and the goal was to bring everyone to an end. However, as the squads were about to break into fire teams for the course, 2 recruits got the bright idea to try to skirt the course. As they did, shots of gunfire littered the air for a moment, then ceased. As the platoon looked toward the deviants, they found them motionless when a voice spoke over a hidden speaker. A bit of forewarning, "Stay on the course," was literal. "Stray from the current path and you will be neutralized by simunition rounds. Retrieve the 2 deviants, but you must low crawl, or risk the same fate." The faces of the platoon said that they didn't want to, but Jay and Cameron took the initiative and crawled toward the 2 who lay on their backs and pulled them until they made their way onto the trail. The voice began, "The sim round's effects will last about 6 hours before they can even begin to wake up. Their fates are up to you." Thoughts on punishments were already being suggested, stating that if they were willing to circumvent the course, then it was their fault, and they should be punished for it. Others disagreed and said that they should bring them. 2 from their squads volunteered to stay behind and wait for them to wake up, while the rest of the platoon continued with the course. There were only 4 lanes, and the squads were set up into fire teams as they proceeded forward. When the first group entered the muddied water, cries of frustration were sounded. Their socks were drenched, and at least one half of their body was wet, and the cool breeze didn't help alleviate their discomfort. The sounds of gunfire also littered the air, making those who stayed behind hit the deck and took cover by some torso-high brick walls. The tops of the lanes were covered with barbed wire, and the way forward was blocked by a berm. They couldn't see past it, and the only way forward was to crawl through a semi-flooded concrete tunnel beneath the dirt mound. Jay and Cam were next, along with their 2 fire team members, Fields and Soren. As they crawled, Cam made it a point to detail where the water made its home, while Jay and the others took the time to roll themselves into muddy water, effectively drenching themselves in the cold embrace of mud water. This greatly eased Jay when he was fully enveloped in wet clothes rather than partially wet ones. When they entered the tunnel and made their way through about 50 feet of waist-high water, they were met with the entirety of the course. At the end of the tunnel, Jay and company were met with a view that overlooked the rest of the course. They were at the precipice of a dirt hill, and the downward slope was already muddied from previous recruits. "Are we supposed to slide down this?" commented Fields. "Looks like a 50-foot drop." "I guess we slide down and continue. Not like we have a choice," Jay said with a sigh, and his team complied and slid down from the area with the tunnel. As they reached the bottom, they got into the prone again and started crawling with shots firing overhead of the barbed wire. The sounds of whizzing from the bullet made its way into his eardrums. His team continued until they reached a halfway point of the low crawl section when explosions from the side of the course erupted in smoke and dust. Luckily, their lanes in the mud depressed just enough to cover their prone body, but their bodies still rocked from the explosions. "Oh, come on!" sounded a Soren to his right with clear dismay. Jay disregarded the complaint and kept his head down as he continued to crawl, with chunks of dirt landing on him with notable force. He was glad for the chest rig and helmet to protect him. When he completed the course, a simple dirt path with a concrete wall lined that the side of the path met his view, and he took this chance to take a breather, not knowing how much stamina he had actually wasted. The next and final course was a long field that started with a half wall that the fire team would use as cover, and wait until the team leader gave the command to advance. The field was mostly grass, with previously made paths from years of use and abuse. It was designed with an alternative style of advancement of a fire team. By alternating every other person two at a time, the fire team could advance while the two who stayed back would provide cover fire. This was known as buddy rushing, a tactic to continuously lay down fire for your team as they continually advance against the enemy. There was no automated fire in this section as indicated by a sign, but a long wall of barbed wire lined the sides of the course, which happened to extend for another 1.5 miles. "Wait, we have to bud rush for 1.5 miles?" said Cam, taking a swig of his canteen. "Gotta build up the stamina somehow. You can't destroy the enemy by maneuver and fire if you don't, well, maneuver and fire," said Fields, taking a large drink from his canteen as well. "Haven't you learned anything from the last 20-odd weeks in recruit training?" Cam acknowledged his comment silently. "Once the next team goes, we're up," Jay said, followed by the silent nods of his fire team. As the next team proceeded, Jay and his fire team took their places by the half wall, in a crouched position, waiting until the next team was further along. When the other team was sufficiently ahead, Jay and his fire team proceeded with the training event. They continued this for the duration of the course, and by the time they made it to the end, Cam, Fields, and Soren were gasping for air, Jay included. "Whoa, what the hell, man?" Soren started. "I didn't think 1.5 miles of rushes would do this to you." "I know what you mean. I've been so used to the 50-meter rushes, but not this," added Fields. Jay noted the next course, and seeing that it was a simple dirt path, they jogged at a slow pace and met the other teams that arrived before them. All were a mess covered in damp clothes, hunched over catching their breath, or taking a drink from their canteen. The next course was an agility course with walls to climb and single logs to cross over. If they failed, they would have to restart from the beginning. This was enforced by an automated targeting system that tracked their movements to their last known checkpoint, which was the beginning. Granted, the entirety of the course was separated into parts, each with a different setup. Jay's fire team cleared the series of obstacles, using each other as step stools over walls, and quickly made their way through the short course, only to be met with a sign planted in the center of a widened dirt road. "Patrol! Progress as a squad to the extraction zone. Leave no one behind." Those who made it past the latest obstacle course waited until the rest of the platoon arrived before progressing, even those who were hit by the automated turrets. The sun was quickly falling, and light was barely filtering through the trees of the hills that surrounded them. There were 4 paths, subsequently marked 1 through 4, and each squad took a path that corresponded to their number. The paths were separated by trees and hollow buildings, but they were wide enough to accommodate 2-lane traffic, which were littered with seemingly purposeless debris. Much of the debris is burned, with hole-riddled civilian vehicles, tires, barrels, etc. Jay figured that the course was supposed to simulate a combat area with the road as their only avenue of approach. Jay's squad, led by Gale, took a tactical column and progressed through the trail. The light was quickly fading, and they equipped their lights, which gave off a red beam. They traveled the path for another 30 minutes, looking at more of the same scenery, when an explosion sounded behind him. "IED," sounded Jay, further alerting his squad to the sudden change in dynamic. 3 of his squad mates were unconscious, and the squad took a defensive perimeter. Those closest to the victims moved to triage their comrades. This practice was normal and expected, since they had spent a decent 2 weeks on nothing but combat triage and first aid in an active combat zone. The first was to stop the bleeding, check for breathing, treat the wound, and treat for shock. Steps that had proven to save lives in the heat of the moment. When the triage was settled, Jay finally noticed that Cam was one of the 3 victims taken by the IED, and rushed to his side. "Hey Cam, can you hear me? Come on, bud, wake up!" He smacked Cam's face slightly and noticed his eyes flutter. I can't move my legs," he said in a dazed fashion as Jay looked over his body and noticed paint across his right leg and waist. It was the same substance that would normally neutralize them if it hit the chest, but it was designed to target the lower extremities and offered some form of hallucinogen. "This might be a little tight, bud." He pulled a tourniquet from one of Cam's pouches and applied it to the right leg. He applied it just tight enough and proceeded to bring Cam over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The sudden dead weight was doing a number on his thighs. Fields holstered his own rifle while he proceeded the rest of the way with Cam's in hand. Then chaos erupted. Simulated explosions with displays of smoke illuminated by the flash of light, paired with shots of gunfire, sounded the area, the sound carrying over from the other paths. "Move!" Gale commanded over the noise of combat, with maniacal laughter among the squad. This was the first any of them had experienced something as visceral as combat, simulated or not. They still maintained a perimeter around the men carrying their partners with their weapons trained outward. This continued for a while, and Jay's thighs felt like they were on fire, but he pressed on, his slung rifle swinging tight to his body. For the remainder of the trail, they waded through thigh-deep water and evaded the numerous amounts of debris, until the noise faded when the last of their group passed through the exit, which was a gate flanked by 2 flares that looked like they were activated remotely. Jay found a small grassy hill in their clearing and lay Cam upon it and placed his rifle beside him. He placed a finger under his nose and confirmed he was still breathing, although it was labored. At the end of the trail was a gate with a timer that counted down. Next to the gate was a map of the next area, with the squad leaders huddled around it. When they were finished, the squad leaders returned from the electric board and returned to their respective squads. "Listen to me now, second squad," Gale started. "We've got about 7 hours until the gates open, so we have this time to rest. Eat some chow and get some sleep. The first 7 will stand to watch, and we'll rotate in the next area." He left, and the squad set their assault packs on the ground and pulled out a sleeping bag, using their packs as pillows. The platoon was able to rest and readied for the following day when the last watch woke up the platoon. It was still early in the morning, and the sun had yet to rise, but they put on their damp BDUs and lined up with their squad at the gate, which was now open. At the base of the trail that led to the upper shelf was flanked by 2 shacks. As each person approached, they scanned their military ID and received 180 rounds of simunition that came in thin, biodegradable boxes, which the platoon took the time to load into their magazines before entering the next area. "What happened last night?" Cam asked. "I'm fairly certain you got hit by a sim IED, Jay replied with a laugh. "It was unexpected, but I carried you on my shoulders for almost half a mile." "I am so sorry," he said with sudden realization and regret, but in a light-hearted tone. "Ha ha, it's good, man. Talk about a leg workout, though," he said, rubbing his thighs. The squads convened and generated plans for the next area. There was a display just before the trail to the upper shelf. It was a map that depicted the combat area with topographical lines and pixelated overhead shots of buildings and roads. Moran of the first squad was the first to speak. "Listen here," he ordered, calling attention to the display. He pointed to a set of buildings down the road from their entrance, with a road leading diverting to the left and right. "From the information we got from this display, this will be the first time we go against others from another company. We're not to fire upon our brothers in yellow, and we're expected to meet them at the top." He relinquished control and passed it to Spears, leader of the 3rd squad. "This will also be the first time we go against the 3rd combat element. They are apparently some type of automaton that is susceptible to sim rounds and are known to also patrol the roads and compounds of the upper shelf. He pointed to the map and noted that much of it was not very steep. However, the side opposite the compound had a steep hill that spread from left to right, forcing the roads to follow. Beyond it was a field of sparse buildings and trenches. The area was a mix of brown and green, indicating that it was a muddied field of combat. Parts of the shelf were also laden with forest areas, some denser than others. The sand was also closer to the left part of the shelf, and they were glad their route wouldn't take them there. Spears trailed his hand on the path that led to the first compound and then to the road that led right, leading to a smaller compound with a straight road and another to the left. He took a left and stated that they would continue this path and would inevitably take the path of the trenches because beyond it was a series of hills that sat near their next and final entry. That was their most direct path. Countless other paths were littered about that led to smaller buildings and vantage points. This discretion was granted to the squad leaders, and they set off with their squads when everyone was done loading their magazines. Moran and Gale's squads were the first to take the trail, followed by Spears and Collins' squads. When they reached the main road, each person loaded their first mag and entered a tactical column. When they reached about 500 meters from the previously mentioned compound, they split into fire teams, and Jay found himself with Cam, Fields, and Soren. They progressed in a wedge to the compound with Soren in the front, Fields and Cam on the sides, and Jay at the rear. The area before them allowed for multiple fire teams to spread out and apply different formations depending on the terrain. Their area was sparse with trees and bushes, but they progressed to the first compound. When they reached the edge of their tree line, they observed the roads and the buildings at the junction. Using his rifle scope, he noticed thinly framed mechanic bodies with rifles as they patrolled the roads. The sun was cresting the horizon, and their frames reflected the light. Jay's fire team and two others organized a strike on the right flank as the group was leaving the compound and did so to get the other teams to flank on the left. Jay's group fired when they were free from cover, and after a couple of seconds, the enemy fired back. Shots started coming from the buildings in their direction, and one of the teams directed their fire into the buildings, grabbing their attention. Gunshots towards them ceased, but it continued in the town. They took this time to systematically advance by alternating fire teams forward, enabling a fire team rush. By the time the perimeter teams entered the town, the fighting had ceased, leaving control to Jay's platoon. It wasn't long until their platoon gained control and cleared the buildings. The only items present were a modicum of sim rounds passed around to those who were low, and they refilled their magazines to full. They continued on the route previously mentioned, and continued in a dispersed fashion with their fire teams. The road to their next destination was approximately 6 miles when they encountered a disturbance half a mile out from the buildings on their route. They stayed low and moved closer to the point of interest while using their environment as cover. As Jay drew close, he could hear laughing coming from the nearby buildings. He peeked around a corner and saw several surrounding one of the bots. "What do you think will happen to us if we break it?" one asked, with a blue band around his and his allies' arms. "I don't know," another said, firing an extra shot into it. "It should still work. Maybe." Jay motioned to his team about the enemy, and intel was then silently passed to nearby fire team leaders. When given the order, he fired into the closest one, who still brandished his rifle at the robot, and his team followed suit. Chaos erupted, and the rest of their team came to their aid, but their blue allies were already neutralized. Their rivals were then blindsided by the rest of Jay's platoon that enveloped the small compound, and they shot the survivors in the chest, giving his platoon a 6-hour head start for the next objective. They made it known that they were not to take from their enemy, even if it wasn't explicitly mentioned, whether it was right or not. They continued on the trail toward the fields and found themselves at the edge with some buildings they had cleared. The buildings were dilapidated and offered concealed surveillance on the field. The road they took to the field ended at the buildings, and the field was encased in a valley of hills to their east and west. The road on the map from before had continued on the other side, and the field was a mix of shallow trenches, craters, and barbed wire barriers. "What do you see, Jay?" Gale said from the stairs to the second story of a building Jay peered from using his rifle scope. "The field is our only direct option, but I think the enemy is digging in on the other end. Looks like there was a route that leads to that end from the west." "I'll see if we can't flank them," said Gale, and retreated to the rest of the group. They split off the fourth squad that took the route south, steering clear of the compound they defeated and making their way westward. The rest of the platoon set up a rear-facing defense in the buildings overlooking the field. They would wait until the first shadow was cast over the field before they began their assault. The enemy on the other side of the field refused to move, and soon the shadows began to cast over the mountain. The sun rested behind the hill south of the field, and a couple of fire teams used that to help them creep along the field toward the other end. The darker it got, the harder it was for them to see. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, shots erupted on the other end, which was their mark. Those not vital to the rear defense pulled away and joined the rush charge to the other end of the field, exchanging fire with those who still held an angle on Jay's platoon advance. They tried firing into the field, but ended up hitting a couple of their squad mates, but Jay's fire team, and one other, made a successful right-flanking maneuver and fired into the prone gunner. The rest of the platoon, those who could fight, caught up to their rivals and began a sweep of the weakly dug foxholes. The total force consisted of Purple Band recruits. Their squad mates carried those from their platoon that were hit to the gate that led to the final area. When they crested a hill that led to the gate, they were met with a series of paths that seemingly led through toward the next entry. Those with full fire teams spread out on the trails in fire team columns and actively scanned the terrain. They slowly crept forward and paused at every suspicious sound. Some fire teams would come across an enemy team, and they were fired upon when it was made known that they were not part of Hotel Company. The hills they occupied close to the second checkpoint were a war zone, and Jay's platoon solidified their tactics. They recovered all from the engagements, and when they were clear of combat, pressed forward to the gate. Their secondary advance on the hills improved when it was noticed that many of the groups they found were nothing but fire teams or scouts, at least only those who got close enough. After several more minutes of walking, their platoon reached the gate and secured a clearing that overlooked the area entrance. They took their collapsible shovel and dug foxholes of their own and split into teams of two. One would dig, and the other would hold an arc of fire. This is how they organized their foxholes, with overlapping fields of view in a wide area. They did this to maintain control of the gate and to make way to gather the rest of their company. "Jay, you got any spare snacks?" Cam asked as he continued to dig his hole. "Maybe. What's in it for me?" replied Jay as he faced outward of his foxhole with his rifle. "The kindness of your heart will make the day of an individual," he said with a straight face. "Then no," Jay replied curtly. "Come on, all this digging is using too much work for such little food." Cam continued to complain. To stop him, Jay tossed him some jalapeno cheese topping. "You owe me," to which Cam graciously accepted and finished digging his hole for Jay to continue on his. They had less time to sleep, and Jay took the first watch while Cam slept in his shallow hole. Jay was woken up by the sounds of gunfire that erupted near the gate, and two platoons fought each other. The light from the gate illuminated several soldiers, revealing they had yellow bands, and Cam was seen firing into the group that attacked further on the road, as did others in his troop. Spears called out to the group on the defense, "Hey! What platoon are you from, or we shoot you too?" There was a pause, and a strained yell came from the nearest recruit. 21, 63. "We're 21, 61. We're here to help." His squad fired on the rival group who were now on the defensive, when they were routed by Moran's squad from the west and retreated to beyond the field of trenches. They didn't fire on those trying to carry their friends out, but they kept a watchful eye on them and their surroundings, as the sun was starting to break on the horizon. The squad leaders spoke with each other and agreed that since they were of the same company, they would progress up the mountain when the gates opened, which, from the timer, was only 15 minutes from now. Platoon 2161 and 2163 held their arc of fire until the gates opened, and when they did, those that were wounded were carried first up the mountain in stretchers that 2163 procured from one of their compounds. The rest of the platoons filtered through the gate, starting with the outermost teams until all started their climb. The platoon was wary, and since they were the first, they relaxed from the thought of an ambush, but they still kept their eyes peeled. As luck would have it, as soon as their alertness lulled, a crack of gunfire erupted from the forest to their right. "Contact right!" shouted the first to notice them. The platoons turned right and went prone, simultaneously firing into the wilderness. This was another common tactic when on patrol in a column. The sun filtered through the brush and trees, and the recruits shot at what shined back until the last of it went dark, and flashes of the enemy's rifles ceased. A team advanced and verified that the bots were the culprits of the ambush, and were down for the count. Tensions were heightened, and they continued their climb in silence. They continued to look behind them whenever the trail was more than a bend for the other group. The fear of them catching up prompted them to quicken the pace, and with some of the previously wounded having their tranquilizer effects wear off. They lessened the burden greatly from their carriers, and the overall pace of the mixed platoon grew. A cry of joy erupted from one of the members in the front, and those in the front began to run. Jay, Cam, and the others caught up. They too shouted in joy. They had finally entered the armistice zone, and combat was now prohibited beyond this point. Jay continued, sweat dampening his freshly dried uniform and undersuit as he ran ahead with Cam in tow. Jay and the others finally crested the hill to a leveled clearing, and a landing zone was present on the far edge of the area. Spots for golf, hotel, and India Company were set up with decorations of flags from the Terran Republic and the orbital drop raiders. They had made it to the peak, and tears were shed upon their realization. They had passed their test. They were now raiders.
Gunnery Sergeant Slaughter. Report. The latest group of recently graduated raiders had finally made their way up the mountain and were successful in their mission with as little guidance as legally required under the ODR training doctrine. They'll be ready for tasking in 10 days, and they have already gotten orders for their commands to the latest front. On a side note, I have shared some names that I feel would be good candidates for the TRU program. Most notably, Jay, for his past experience as a pilot. I have also listed names for the sake of squad cohesion. Private Kurt J., Private First Class Caden Spears, Private Camille Cameron, Private First Class Cody Gale. But, as is tradition, they will be tasked to a combat-ready unit in the 4th Battalion. I recommend they do their first drop with Cobra Company. They're easy on the new guys, but they're also not green. Then we can see about getting them into the program. Recipient, General Brooke, General of the ODR.